Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Emily Burt.
And I'm Lucinda Rouse. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. This week we'll be assessing progress with the voluntary sector's anti-racism journey over the past 4 years and beyond, and asking what makes an organisation truly anti-racist.
But first, our senior news reporter Emily Harle is with us. And Emily wrote an analysis piece for the Third Sector website last week asking how charities can get the most out of young trustees. Something that the sector is certainly very interested in. And Emily, I know that you were particularly well placed to write this, having served on the Scottish Youth Parliament's trustee board a few years ago at the age of 19. Tell us a little bit about that.
So when I went into it, I had zero governance experience. So the prospect of going through board papers and financial accounts was an incredibly daunting thing to me. Luckily, the Scottish Youth Parliament is an entirely youth-led board, which means that they really put a lot of effort into making sure that their young people are properly trained and they get a proper induction. So that was a massive help to me. The main challenge that I had during my time on the board was it was actually just right about when COVID hit. So my remit at the time was member support and communications, which during COVID meant a lot of sharing pretty bad news about sittings not happening and members not getting that in-person engagement. So we really had to try and figure out new ways to engage with members and make sure they were still staying enthused about what they were doing and why they were involved in the Scottish Youth Parliament.
So that sounds like a baptism of fire for communications as your first trustee experience at that time. So for this piece that you wrote last week, you spoke to several people with experience of young trusteeship. What did they have to say about avoiding tokenism? Because I know that that is a major concern when charities are bringing on younger members to their board. How can they set up young trustees to make an actually meaningful contribution?
So that was something I really wanted to address because as this is an issue very close to my heart, I wanted to make sure we were talking about how to avoid tokenism and make sure that young people are getting the best out of it and the charities are getting the best out of it. So Saeed Acha, who I spoke with, he is the chief executive of Youth Leads, which he actually started when he was 15. And he told me it's really vital for charities to nail the purpose of why they're engaging young trustees in governance. So don't just do it in order to get young people in the room. Do it because you want to actually hear what they have to say, you value their opinions, and just like you would with any other trustees.
And obviously it's one thing to bring a young trustee into an organisation, but you can't just recruit and then leave them because that's not going to do anything constructive. You need to really, there's a big development piece to go on here. So when you are training and upskilling young trustees, how should that training be different from what is offered to a more typical trustee who tends to be around, say, retirement age?
So every trustee needs an in-depth induction and training, but as you say, it is especially important for younger trustees to get that in-depth training, that in-depth knowledge of what their role is and what the charity does and where the charity is going as well. Because younger people might not have any governance experience at all. And so being thrust into that role without any knowledge of what you're meant to be doing, how to read board papers, how to go through financial accounts, all of this stuff, that can be really daunting when you first start if you don't get that training. So it's important to have those support mechanisms in place, whether that's a mentoring scheme or links with organisations like the Young Trustees Movement or external advisors too. The Scottish Youth Parliament's Chief Executive, Jamie Dunlop, spoke about that a bit in my piece too. The Youth Parliament has a lot of external advisors that they rely on to guide their trustees and make sure that they have as much knowledge as possible. Also, it's really important to consider that young people might not have the same availability as other trustees. So if you've got a trustee board that's all around retirement age, 2 p.m. on a working day is an ideal time for a meeting, but that doesn't necessarily work when you've got young people who are going to be in education or in work. So it's really all about that communication and making sure that you're talking with everyone on your board, not just the young people, trying to figure out what times work best for meetings and how to catch them up if they're unable to make it for whatever reason.
And then presumably also the length of their term as a trustee might have to be adjusted to accommodate the fact that young people have often very different and fast-moving circumstances, such as leaving home, going into higher education, starting a job, whatever it may be. How can boards be more accommodating in that respect?
So succession planning was a huge talking point. So we did discuss how term limits are important, not necessarily just for young trustees, but also just to make sure that you've got that sort of happy start and the happy end. That's something that Amelia Ireland, the chair of the Young Trustees Movement, mentioned in the piece. And also having more than one young trustee on your board, because then you've got someone who can be that glass ceiling breaker, as James Cathcart from Young Voices Heard put it. And then other younger trustees are coming up and learning the ropes from them, and also seeing representation on the board already, which is always a really important thing. And we also discussed youth advisory boards as a way to do that succession planning. So a lot of charities are exploring youth advisory boards at the moment. And while there is a risk that youth advisory boards could be tokenistic, what I was hearing from a lot of those people I was speaking to who work in this youth-led space, they were saying that these boards are actually a great way to get young people interested in governance, get them involved, and make sure that you've got a cohort of young people who already have a knowledge of the charity and they've already got that basis and that enthusiasm to go into governance.
Loads of great advice there, Emily. And of course, you can read much more about it in your analysis piece, which came out a week ago. So do definitely check that out.
Moving on to our main discussion. The wave of racist and Islamophobic violence that gripped the UK last month was yet another grim reminder that systemic racism and extremism remain major unresolved issues in our society. The killing of 3 girls in Southport on the 29th of July sparked riots by far-right protesters across the country, fueled by disinformation and misinformation spread on social media. Much of the violence targeted Muslims and immigrants, and charity leaders were quick to issue statements that publicly condemned the behaviour. Charities also played a big role in fact, in the response and rebuild efforts among communities damaged by the riots. But how does this valuable work fit in with the longer-term journey of eliminating institutional racism in the voluntary sector? In the wake of George Floyd's murder in May 2020 and the activism that followed it, a wave of sector leaders publicly declared their commitment to becoming anti-racist organisations. So, more than 4 years down the line, how much progress has actually been made?
Well, we're joined today for a discussion in the studio by Collette Philip. Collette is the founder of the anti-racist brand strategy agency Brand by Me, which helps organisations build brands that drive social justice. And she's worked for a number of charities in the past, including Barnardo's and World Animal Protection. Hi, Collette. It's great to have you with us.
Hello.
So, in June this year, Brand by Me published a report called Dismantle, which audited the progress, or the lack of progress maybe, on anti-racism work carried out by the country's top 30 charity brands, as listed in Third Sector's Charity Brand Index. Collette, to start, could you just briefly summarise the aims of the Dismantle report and tell us a little bit about your high-level findings?
So one of the biggest questions we always get asked, whether it's me speaking or we're doing consultancy work with a charity, is, have you got any examples from other brands? It's what we always ask. Have you got any other examples? And we also know that before we do any work looking at anti-racism within a brand, we always start with an audit. And so we came up with the idea probably about a year ago to do a sector-wide audit of brands. We found that commitments to anti-racism, as mentioned in 2020, have been diluted and morphed into some vague ticking of boxes around diversity and maybe representation. There are some sectors within the broader charity sector that very clearly don't see anti-racism or even diversity as something as relevant to the cause. If there is a focus only on diversity and representation, that racism continues to persist and show up even in the brand. And we also saw that unless a organisation has made a commitment at a brand level and a really expressed commitment, very clear around anti-racism, their anti-racism work, even if they've made internal promises, will falter because there's just not the accountability of having made a really clear public commitment. Where organisations had made a public commitment, we were way more likely to see evidence of anti-racist practice consistently in the brand. And then I guess the final thing we saw, which was super interesting, we saw some repeated, very clear and very specific ways that racism shows up in brands. So things like tokenism, or white experts as default, or using the white gaze, so where white people are presumed to be the audience for any charity comms, and lots of other things like that. But there are some really repeated, specific and consistent ways that racism shows up, which obviously we know from our work, but it was really interesting to see these repeated and playing out across a much larger subset of brands than we'd ever been able to work with.
And could we take a step back just for a sec? And could you please tell us what the difference is between a non-racist and an anti-racist organisation?
Well, it's Professor Angela Davies that said it, and I love it because said it so many years ago, but it's come up again and again. It came up again and again around 2020. It's come up, and I pretty much use it in every workshop that we ever do around anti-racism, which is that it's not enough to be not racist. You know, it's either anti-racist or racist, and that's totally true. So where people are non-racist, what it does, it sort of demonstrates a real understanding of how racism works, right? So being non-racist is a passive stance. We are not demonstrating visible signs of the very limited thing we've understood as being racism. That's what not racist indicates. And we saw this again and again in the report, because I would say that the majority of charities fall into that non-racist category. We saw few signs of like overt racist slurs or really racist tropes. Very few. Like I think we found like 4 or 5 examples of that. But this kind of non-racist stance where people are just thinking that avoiding those very overt things is enough is what we saw a lot of. And I said it involves this misunderstanding about kind of how racism works, because where even if it's an individual or an organisation is not racist, they are avoiding overt forms of racism, but they are also avoiding engaging with maybe the structural ways that it shows up, or the ultimate objective of racism, which was to embed white supremacy, right? So this thing was created called white so that people then designated as white could be superior. That's it. That is absolutely. So where people are going not racist, it's sort of avoiding all of that and just in this very static and passive limited stance. Whereas anti-racism is about tackling racism in all of its forms, the systemic and the structural and the interpersonal, and doing it simultaneously and concurrently. And this is really interesting because I found that we've observed it quite a lot, that sometimes because of the confusion between diversity and anti-racism, some well-intentioned people doing diversity work sort of just rebranded it as anti-racism, but anti-racism is about tackling racism in all of its forms, which means you have to talk about white supremacy and that end goal, the benefit of racism, because then when you're in a white dominant environment, as our sector still is, there's a dominance, there's an inequity in terms of economic progress, there's an inequity in terms of people's access and safety, and that's the goal and objective of white supremacy. It goes beyond just numbers. This is not about, just simply racialized folks being the minority in this country. It goes well beyond that.
And so according to your audit, the majority of these charities that you were looking at are currently still falling into that passive stance, and you're seeing these repeating patterns across all these different subsectors of passive non-racism. But
which is tipping people into then racism, very much racism. It's also an understanding of what racism is. And so when people are not racist, because they have a very limited, or organisations are not racist, they have such a limited understanding of what racism is and how it shows up, that they're just not doing that. So ultimately, it's what the quote says, it's not not racist or racist. It's anti-racist or racist. There is no not racist, because if you're not doing anti-racism work, by default, you'll be propping up racism in multiple ways. And that's what we saw across the report repeatedly.
And how have your findings been received by the people who feature or the sector more broadly?
So I will say at a sector level, there's been interest. I will say, as always, in this kind of passive, not racist way, people are very keen to show enthusiasm for the fact that we're doing it. Oh, this is a great thing. Yeah, this sounds amazing. And then it's also the research effect. So we did, before doing it, we did sort of do, admittedly, limited kind of audience, sort of just temperature check to check this is something people, and people were like, yeah, so need this. This would be brilliant. Of course we're going to do it. Yes, of course we'll pay for it. But it's also the research effect of asking the question like that. No one wants to be the one to say, no, we definitely don't want to report about racism. No one wants to be that person. So, and I reckon, obviously we did not ask that question. That would be ridiculous. But regardless of how you ask the question, pretty much you're always going to get a positive response. And that's what we've got, is the default sort of positive murmurings. What's really interesting for me is that the top brands, according to the CBI, I think because of the strength of their brands, have very little impetus to act and commit to active anti-racism. So there's not the skin in the game. There's not the sort of vested interest in changing the status quo, which has worked very well for a charity, worked very well in terms of income generation. So, and that's not to say, I think that, you know, we are a small agency with limited resources. We were very pleased that, you know, for the write-up in third sector, that got us a lot of interest, but interest hasn't resulted in very much action. And so that's been a really interesting learning, because there's always this thing, the thing is, I knew it to be a myth, but also I think we had to undergo the exercise to prove it, which is that one of the causes of racism is ignorance. And I'm going to say no, because even before 2020, there's so much information available on what racism is and how it shows up. Systemic racism did not start in 2020, neither did organisations doing anti-racism, including our own. So the reception, on hindsight, which is always 2020, isn't it? It is not surprising that enthusiasm has not translated into action, because that's also been the case around anti-racism. So that wealth of commitments that we saw in the very brief resurgence of interest in the Black Lives Matter movement, because I'm always hesitant to talk about a specific incidence of racist violence and murder as being a catalyst, because I think the catalyst was probably pandemic, slow news cycle, and then a growing understanding of inequity that people's privilege couldn't shield themselves from, I guess. It's incredibly useful to have this picture of what the sector looks like. It's going to be useful to the sector. It is useful to sector organisations and bodies, and we're talking to a few. It will be useful to individual brands, because now when people go, have you got any examples? I'm like, yes. How do you know how racism shows up? Here, this is how we know. We've looked. It's all that sort of thing, which makes it quite useful.
So speaking about examples, would you be able to share an example of a charity that was included in your study that is doing particularly well on their anti-racist journey? And could you tell us what sets them apart from others?
I'm not going to share individual names of charities, simply because where we found that charities are very clearly, from a brand point of view, on an anti-racist journey, it is a journey. So it doesn't mean, I don't want to give the impression that, yes, A, as charities so often said, they get a cookie, or B, that everything is perfect. They've eradicated racism. Those two things are definitely not true. But I think there were three organisations that got our green rating, which was on an anti-racist journey. And they had a few things in common. I think the first one was that, as I said, they'd made a really clear commitment to being anti-racist, and they actually used the words anti-racist, anti-racism. A couple of them talked about white supremacy and how that shows up. So that clear and tangible commitment is absolutely essential at a brand level. Not because it's, again, not about saying something to look good. It's just simply because you then have a stake in the ground that people can hold you accountable to. And that's really important. I think that the other thing they had in common is that they had all clearly, interestingly, been doing some sort of anti-racism or decolonisation work way prior to 2020, which meant that what 2020 did was allowed them to maybe realign or recommit or intensify their sustained efforts, but that effort has been sustained and consistent. The other thing that they have in common is that they consistently name and call out racism, white supremacy, colonialism, and related forms of oppression as relevant and how they're showing up in their specific cause or sector. So they're naming it and repeatedly so. So when they're able to take an incidence of something and say, and this is why, link it back to that systemic racism, which is super important, because if you're not willing, able to call out racism, even when it's your own sector, even when it's your own work, it's going to be very difficult for you then to continue in your anti-racism work. And
just on that quickly, these sectors, are they not necessarily ones that directly address social injustice?
I think that everything, any sector in charity is going to be addressing inequity in some way. I think that every cause, I worked, as I said, at World Animal Protection. We're a global animal welfare charity. And animal welfare is absolutely inextricably linked to social inequity, just because of the role of animals and the importance of animals in certain economies, the impact of the destruction of our climate and environment, and the role of that and the impact on animals and ecosystems, and in turn the actors around who's doing that. So, of course, there are some charities where justice is more forefront in the articulation of their mission, but all charities are kind of handling inequity in some way. So yes, in terms of those three, there's a breadth. They're not all from one specific sector, no. So yeah, that's really important. And then the final thing I would say about, just back to organisations that seem to be further on the journey with their anti-racism work, ultimately, they aren't trying to do this alone. There's visible sort of power shift in terms of the way that they are partnering with and collaborating with and engaging with global majority communities, breadth of and across, so if it's a UK charity, across the UK, different communities, and the breadth and scope and depth and the kind of the power exchange in those interactions looks very different to the traditional charity model. And if it's a global charity, the same goes. So, and that's super important, because ultimately one of the ways that racism does show up in this sector is in the allocation of resources away from global majority-led and organisations that are led and for racialised folks. So, of course, that power shift is kind of essential, and that's also really evident. And when I say that, it's evident in the brand, because you can see it. You can see it in the way that the brand, the stories that are used to evidence the mission, and who is speaking and who is centred, and how issues are framed, and whether the systemic and structural stuff is ignored or whether it's actually rooted in those kind of root causes, that sort of thing. You can just see it.
Now, I think what is really important, which you've said, is that, these organisations in particular have been making sustained commitments to anti-racism since before 2020. And it's an excellent point you make. We talk about 2020 all the time, because I think as a sector, 2020 was viewed as a watershed moment when all of these leaders came out and they made their statements about no more, we are changing this. But of course, we are talking about dismantling centuries of systemic institutional oppression when we're talking about anti-racism work. Obviously, this is something that is much older than the past 4 years. So I wonder, from your perspective as an organisation that has been doing anti-racism work dating well back to before this time, and especially in the recent insights that you've had, in the context of the fact that we have very recently again seen a number of public statements coming out which again condemn the racist violence that we saw in recent months, saying that as a sector we have to recommit to the anti-racism journey, and it is a journey, where do you see progress being the slowest?
I think where charities don't understand or are not looking at the connection between racial justice and their causal mission, because I said, again, I said it in like before, that these structures of colonialism and white supremacy were used to embed so many of the inequities, injustices, and causes that the sector seeks to tackle and represent. So where people are not understanding those links willfully because of the organisation having a vested interest in repeating white supremacy. So that means, so for example, very individual level, if your board and your leaders are all white supremacy is working for you. And as much as it is uncomfortable and difficult to acknowledge, it's true. One of the exercises we do when we work with leaders is we use the framework of white supremacy culture, a distilled version of like the massive body of work done by Temakun, but we use a little framework based on that. And we get people to talk about how is white supremacy A, showing up in your leadership, and B, how does it serve you? Because there are principles of white supremacy culture, so progress equals bigger, like perfectionism, that do actually serve charities and have done this program, and they at once work to just embed systemic racism. So that's the first one, is that where the leaders of charities are invested in that status quo of white supremacy, even if they wouldn't say that. Of course, they're not going to say it, but that is very, very true. Where, sectors, as I said, haven't made the links for themselves between whether it's social inequity and social injustice, whether it's racial justice, whether it's the impact of causes and how it is impacting specifically global majority communities and countries within the global majority. And then also, I guess, where progress has been really slow is where diversity has been used as a defensive measure very quickly. And you saw this in 2020. So let's say June 2020, anti-racism commitment. Quickly, done, knee-jerk, quick. Even if it's like, racism is wrong, bad, awful, and we must do something against it. That effectively is a very immature, but it is an anti-racism commitment. It's a very oversimplified anti-racism commitment, but it is one, right? So if you come out and say something like that, that is an anti-racism commitment. Then a month, 2 months later, after having spoken to the board or met as leaders or whatever, or had some feedback from your donor base or whatever it is, immediately going, right, what we're going to do is recommit to D&I. That's diversity as a defence. And unfortunately, D&I and anti-racism are not the same thing. Don't get me wrong. DEI, so diversity, equity, not just equality and inclusion, is really, really useful for doing some things within organisations. It's really, really useful for maybe starting to look at how you might at least acknowledge multiple systems of oppression in one go. But what it can't do, DEI does not tackle systemic racism, it just doesn't. And what it does, even the way that the practice of DEI came out of the US civil rights movement, but was designed to bring civil rights into corporate structures, and in doing so, make it palatable. So it took civil rights and went, how can we make this easy for corporates to do? So that act of taking racial justice and making it easy and palatable for corporate structures is exactly why DEI can't tackle systemic racism. It can't. It wasn't designed to. It wasn't designed to do that. So where diversity is being used as a defense, so you've gone, systemic racism is an issue here. Okay, cool. What we're going to do is do some DEI work. That kind of defense play also slows massively progress. And it's funny, whenever I'm answering these questions, no, I'm not naming organisations or specific sectors. It's not because I'm trying to be nice. It simply is because that's a distraction. It's a distraction because ultimately there's more like characteristics and hallmarks, and it could be any organisation. But they're some of the things that really slow progress down. I mean, there's probably others.
You've raised so many interesting and important points and given us all considerable food for thought. So as a final question, can you give us and our listeners any pointers towards useful resources for charities who are wanting to do more and accelerate their anti-racism journey?
I'm going to only name 3, and they're all led by Black women or non-binary folks, and that's deliberate and intentional. I think the first one, obviously, I'm going to shout out Brand by Me, because, and the reason I am going to is because I think that anti-racism internal work is really useful. However, your brand will work against that. Not because just not simply your brand team and comms teams, but if you're not looking at the brand specifically, you will do all this good internal work and then you're going to really struggle. And your brand will undermine it. What you see as the needs of brands and comms will send you in a direction that is directly opposed to anti-racist work, and that's simply just because of some of the ways that brands and communication have been built and done, not just in our sector, just generally, kind of works against anti-racism work. So I think, the work of Brand by Me is well worth looking up. I'm going to shout out Uncharitable for previously BAME fundraising conference, because Uncharitable, what Martha and team do, the wealth of resources, there's just so much. Even their YouTube channel alone is just this treasure trove. They do really accessible, brilliant events on dismantling white supremacy and genuinely moving towards racial justice and liberation. And it's all very specifically relevant to the charity sector. And then the third one is a book called The Anti-Racist Organisation by Shireen Daniels. It's like a handbook for what you need to do. I don't really... And there's also a book called What White People Can Do Next by Emma Dabiri. She wrote it in 2019, 2020. Literally, the book, you just walk it through like a handbook and read it again and again and apply it as a leader to your organisation. And then where you struggle, get anti-racism experts, plural, in to help you. That's what I would say. And at this point, you can hear my tone. It's not necessarily gentle or guiding, because there's such an amazing body of work out there from so many different hardworking, burnt out, brilliant racial justice practitioners who are from multiply minoritized backgrounds, who are all doing so much of this work generously. And the kind of, but what can we do question is, it comes back to that sort of passive sort of power dynamic, which is like, we expect you to give it to us then if you want us to change it. You know what I mean? And it's, so I'm now a bit like, look, these resources are there, go use them and recommit, or don't. Because I will say that the way we started this by talking about the racist violence that has recently kind of erupted again in the UK, I don't want to talk about the horrible murders of those little girls as being anything to do with this, because it wasn't. It's not anything to do with that. This violence was going to happen. It's written in, because the racism of our society, UK society specifically, is always looking for multiple exit points. So to be clear, anti-immigration and anti-Muslim hateful rhetoric is a new way for it to be an acceptable form of racism, a societally sanctioned forms of racism. It's a new way for state violence to show up. So it didn't start on that day. It wasn't anything to do with those murders. We saw it being politicised and weaponised for votes in the recent UK election. We saw it before with the Brexit vote. This is just the natural consequences of it's nothing more than that. And when I say, and also the kind of condemnation, shock, horror response, I'm like, okay, all that listening and learning that people said they were doing in 2020, you probably weren't, because one thing I'll say to you is that is not new to me. If you are from a racialized community, it is likely that you face violence of some sort all the time. And what this was maybe more coordinated, and it happened at one given time, maybe slightly larger. But let's not be confused or allow this to dilute our focus on the actual structural dismantling of, as you said, centuries of racial inequity in the service of white supremacy. Because actually, again, racism, function, distraction. This racist violence allows people to go, oh my God, that's awful. Let's show up in the streets and march. Don't get me wrong, that's cool. and then go back to the kind of comfortable status quo again. And so it's really important as a sector that we just don't get distracted. I mean, I'm always skeptical of organisations that are going to use one moment to recommit. But you know what works for you? If you needed this to recommit, now is the time. But let's not let this be another issue our statements of condolences and horror and shock, and then go back to exactly the violent status quo that has led us here yet again.
Collette Philip, thank you so much for coming in and talking to us today. It's been great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Collette, and we'll include the link to her dismantle report in the show notes to this episode. And that's it for this week. We'll be back again next week with UK Youth's Chief Executive, Ndidi Okezi, to talk about her thoughts on the need for a more joined-up charity sector and what learnings can be taken from the youth space. Please do follow us on the podcast platform you use. As ever, we would also really appreciate a positive rating. Our producer is Nav Pal.